Mr. Riley, per the preliminary county rezoning application, your property is now designated as Annex Parcel 7B of the Willow Creek Estates Plan Community. That means your rusty old tractor is in violation of 3 separate covenants, and that unsightly woodpile will cost you $500 a day until it's removed. The woman speaking to me, Karen Miller, had the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, a tight, predatory curve of the lips that suggested she was enjoying this far more than any civic duty required. She stood just on her side of my property line, a freshly planted survey stake with a bright pink ribbon marking the boundary she clearly believed was temporary. Flanked by 2 silent, doughy men in identical HOA logo polo shirts, she held a thick binder like a holy text, its plastic cover glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. My tractor, a 1978 John Deere that had been my father's, sat 100 yards behind me, its faded green paint a testament to decades of honest work. The woodpile, neatly stacked and seasoned for the coming winter, was my own labor. To her, they were violations. To me, they were my life. I planted my feet, the worn leather of my boots settling into the soil I owned, and met her gaze. "Karen," I said, my voice low and even, the way my drill sergeant taught me to speak under pressure. "This is my land. It is not, nor will it ever be, part of your little kingdom. You have no authority here." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted rage. "The County Planning Commission seems to disagree," she snapped, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the binder's cover. "The application has been filed. This is just a courtesy notification before the fines become official. You are holding back progress, Mr. Riley, and progress always wins." This was the moment my quiet retirement ended and a war began. If you think this is unbelievable, drop a comment down below with your own HOA nightmare story and let me know where you're watching from. And if you want to see how a master sergeant in the Army Corps of Engineers deals with a bureaucratic tyrant, make sure you subscribe, because you're not going to want to miss a single second of this. Now let me tell you how we got here. I bought these 10 acres of undeveloped North Carolina land 15 years ago, right after I retired from the service. 22 years in the Corps of Engineers, from building bridges under fire in Fallujah to overseeing infrastructure projects in places most people couldn't find on a map, had left me with a deep appreciation for 2 things: solid ground and clear boundaries. This land was my reward. It was a rugged piece of earth, mostly wooded with a rolling meadow in the center, bordered on one side by a state forest and on the other 3 sides by the pristine, meticulously manicured lawns of the Willow Creek Estates. I paid for it in cash with my life savings, and the deed was as solid as the granite bedrock beneath my feet. My plan was simple: build a small, sustainable house with my own 2 hands, raise some chickens, grow a garden, and enjoy the peace I'd spent 2 decades defending for others. The first few years were exactly that. My wife Sarah and I cleared a small section for our home, using the timber we felled to frame the walls. The so-called unsightly woodpile was the byproduct of that effort, a symbol of self-reliance. My initial interactions with the HOA were minimal and, I thought, harmless. Karen Miller had been president for as long as I'd owned the land. Our first run-in was over the sound of my chainsaw on a Saturday morning. She'd driven her golf cart right up to my property line and hollered that the noise was violating their peace and tranquility covenant. I politely pointed out that my property wasn't subject to her covenants and that state law allowed for such noise until 9 p.m. She huffed off, her face a mask of indignation. Another time, it was the fence I was putting up, a simple, sturdy, split-rail fence to mark my boundaries. She sent me a formal-looking letter on HOA letterhead demanding I submit the design for architectural review. I used the letter to help start a bonfire that night. These were annoyances, the petty power trips of a woman with too much time and not enough authority. I dismissed them as such. I failed to understand that to a person like Karen, a boundary isn't a line to be respected. It's a challenge to be conquered. Her obsession with my land grew incrementally. She saw my 10 acres of rustic freedom as a personal insult, a glaring imperfection on the edge of her perfect world of matching mailboxes and legislated lawn heights. What I didn't know What I couldn't have known as I stood there facing her that afternoon was that her obsession had finally found a sponsor. A developer named Prestige Builders wanted to expand Willow Creek, and my 10 acres were the key. They were planning a 40-unit luxury condo complex, and my peaceful meadow was where they intended to build the clubhouse. The rezoning application wasn't just a threat, it was the opening salvo in a campaign to seize my land. And Karen was its willing field marshal, armed with bylaws and a bottomless well of entitlement. The week after our confrontation at the survey stake was a master class in bureaucratic harassment. It began with the mail. Every single day, my mailbox was stuffed with official-looking envelopes from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Each one contained a different violation notice, printed on heavy cardstock with the HOA's ostentatious gold-embossed logo at the top. The first was for the tractor, citing Covenant 14.7b. No unlicensed, inoperable, or commercial-grade vehicles may be stored in public view. My John Deere was none of those things, and it wasn't in her public, but the fine was listed at $100 per day. The next was for the woodpile, a violation of Covenant 9.3. All firewood must be stored in an approved screened enclosure, another $100 per day. Then came notices for unapproved landscaping, my vegetable garden, unauthorized structural additions, a chicken coop, and my personal favorite, failure to maintain turf height, referring to the natural meadow where I was standing when she first confronted me. The fines were stacking up, a ridiculous imaginary debt that had surpassed $5,000 by Friday. Of course, I knew they were legally unenforceable, but that wasn't the point. It was psychological warfare, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. The real threat arrived on Wednesday via certified mail. It was a thick packet from the Rutherford County Planning and Zoning Department. Inside was a formal notice of a public hearing to discuss Petition Z-202307, a proposal to rezone and annex parcel ID 772A4 into the Willow Creek Planned Community District. Parcel ID 772. A4 was my land. The petition was filed by Prestige Builders, LLC, with Karen Miller listed as the community liaison. The language was dense, filled with legal jargon and zoning codes, but the intent was crystal clear. They were using an obscure county ordinance that allowed for the involuntary annexation of adjacent, undeveloped parcels for the purpose of cohesive community development, provided the existing community could demonstrate a compelling public interest. Karen's compelling public interest was apparently a new set of condos and a clubhouse. I spread every document across my dining room table, the same table I'd built from an oak tree that once stood on the property. The sheer volume of paper was designed to be demoralizing, but they misjudged their target. In the Corps of Engineers, I'd managed projects with logistical trains miles long and technical specs that filled entire binders. Paper didn't scare me. I spent the next 2 days at the county courthouse, not with a lawyer, but with a notepad and a determination to understand the battlefield. I started in the Register of Deeds, pulling my own deed first. It was ironclad, registered 30 years before Willow Creek was even a blueprint, with no covenants or restrictions attached. Then I pulled the master deed for the entire Willow Creek development. I read every word of its 300 pages, highlighting every mention of expansion, annexation, or adjacent properties. And there it was, buried in Article 12, Section 4, a vaguely worded clause about the developer's right to incorporate contiguous parcels into the association's jurisdiction with county approval, should said parcels remain undeveloped. It was a developer's loophole written by the original builders 20 years ago, likely as a way to gobble up land for future phases. It was weak, legally dubious, and probably wouldn't stand up in court. But Karen and Prestige were banking that I wouldn't have the resources or the will to fight it. They thought I was just some old soldier who wanted to be left alone. They were half right. I did want to be left alone, but they had forgotten what soldiers do when their ground is being taken. I made a phone call. Not to a high-priced lawyer, but to Dave Jensen, a guy I'd served with in the 101st. He'd been a logistics specialist who could track a missing Humvee across 3 countries with nothing but a half-garbled radio transmission. After the Army, he'd gone to law school and become a paralegal, the kind of guy who lived for the fine print. "Dave," I said when he picked up, "I've got a situation here. It involves an HOA and a piece of paper they think is a weapon." I could almost hear him smile through the phone. "Jack, my friend," he replied, "let's show them what a real weapon looks like." With Dave Jensen as my unofficial guide, I transitioned from defense to offense. The first step was to formally and methodically dismantle their paper-thin legal premise. Dave explained that while I could ignore the HOA's ridiculous fines, I absolutely could not ignore the county's rezoning notice. Silence would be interpreted as consent. So, we drafted two letters. The first was a cease and desist addressed to Karen Miller and the Willow Creek HOA Board of Directors. It was a masterpiece of polite, professional, and utterly menacing legal prose. It cited North Carolina property law, the specific date and book of my deed registration, and the complete absence of any recorded covenant binding my land to their association. It stated that their continued harassment, including the issuance of fraudulent fines and trespassing by their agents, the survey stake planners, constituted tortious interference, and that we would seek damages if their actions did not cease immediately. We sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, so I would have a signed record that she received it. The second letter was more complex. It was my formal, written objection to Petition Z 202-307, addressed to the chairman of the Rutherford County Planning Commission. In it, we laid out the clear legal history of my property, predating their entire development. We argued that the undeveloped clause they were trying to exploit was legally inapplicable, as my property was my primary residence and was actively being improved with a home, outbuildings, and agricultural activity. It was far from undeveloped. We attached a copy of my deed, property tax records proving my continuous ownership and payment, and photos of my home, my workshop, and the very tractor and woodpile Karen had deemed violations. We made it clear that this was not an empty parcel of land waiting for a developer. It was my home. I delivered that letter in person to the county clerk, ensuring it was date-stamped and officially entered into the public record for the hearing. The clerk, a weary-looking woman named Brenda, glanced at the file number. "Willow Creek," she sighed, shaking her head. "You're not the first one to have trouble with that bunch." Her comment was a small but significant crack in their armor of respectability. Karen, however, did not back down. She escalated. My cease and desist letter seemed to fuel her rage. A week later, a notice went out in the official Willow Creek newsletter, a glossy pamphlet filled with pictures of perfectly manicured flower beds and smiling polo-shirted residents. Tucked between an announcement for a community potluck and a reminder about recycling bin placement was an article titled "A Commitment to Progress." It didn't mention me by name, but it didn't have to. It spoke of a holdout-adjacent property owner whose uncooperative stance was threatening a multi-million-dollar community enhancement project that would bring a new luxury fitness center, a swimming pool, and significant property value increases for all residents. It painted me as a selfish, backward-thinking hermit, a rusty old gear grinding against the gleaming machine of progress. The smear campaign had begun. The effects were subtle at first. When I drove into town for supplies, I'd get lingering stares from people in cars bearing the Willow Creek resident sticker. A few neighbors who used to give a friendly wave now looked away, pretending to be busy with their lawns. One afternoon, while I was checking my mailbox, a woman I'd never seen before slowed her Lexus SUV, rolled down the window and yelled, "Stop being so selfish. Some of us want a pool." This was Karen's real weapon, not the bylaws but social pressure. She was turning me into the villain in her carefully curated community narrative. She understood that a fight is easier to win when your opponent is isolated. But what Karen, in her insulated world of HOA meetings and garden club politics, failed to grasp was that a soldier is never truly isolated. He has a network, and it was time to activate mine. My first visit was to the Garcias. Manuel and Elena Garcia were in their late 70s and lived on a small 1-acre plot on the other side of my land, another piece of property that had stubbornly resisted being absorbed into the Willow Creek Collective. Their home was immaculate, but their pride and joy was their garden, a riot of tomato vines, pepper plants, and sprawling zucchini that put the HOA's approved landscaping to shame. I found Manuel out back, staking his tomatoes. I explained the situation, showing him the rezoning notice. He wasn't surprised. That woman, he said, his voice thick with a Spanish accent and decades of frustration. She has been after us for years. Elena came out with a tray of iced tea, and they told me their story. Karen had tried to find them for their garden shed, claiming it was an unapproved outbuilding. She had complained about the agricultural odor of their compost pile. She'd even tried to force them to remove a beautiful, hand-painted birdhouse Manuel had built for their anniversary because it wasn't on the HOA's list of approved lawn ornaments. They had fought her off each time, but the constant pressure had worn them down. She makes you feel like a criminal for living on your own land, Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. I asked if they would be willing to write down their experiences, to sign an affidavit. Manuel's eyes hardened. It would be my honor, he said. My next stop was the local VFW post, a modest brick building on the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and old stories. I found a half dozen of my fellow veterans sitting at the bar, guys I'd known for years. There was Tom, a Marine who'd been at Quezon, Mike, a young Air Force crew chief fresh out of Afghanistan, and Sarge, a retired Army First Sergeant who ran the post with an iron fist and a heart of gold. I laid the documents on the bar, right next to the coasters and beer nuts, and told them everything. I didn't frame it as a property dispute. I framed it as a fight against a bully who was trying to take a veteran's home. When I finished, the room was silent. Tom, the old Marine, broke the silence. Son, he said, looking me dead in the eye, you tell us what you need. That was all it took. The word spread like wildfire through the veteran community. My fight became their fight. They saw it for what it was, an abuse of power against one of their own. Sarge offered to put me in touch with a pro bono legal aid service for veterans. Mike, the young Air Force guy, was a tech wizard and offered to help me dig into prestige builders online. A dozen others pledged to show up at the Planning Commission hearing to provide a visible, unignorable presence. The isolation Karen had tried to engineer was backfiring spectacularly. I wasn't just Jack Riley, the stubborn recluse, anymore. I was a member of a community she couldn't touch, a brotherhood forged in something far more real than HOA covenants. While my veteran brothers were rallying, I started going door to door within Willow Creek itself. I avoided the houses with Karen Miller for president, signs on their lawns, and focused on the ones on the fringes. The people I suspected might have their own stories. I found a young family who'd been fined $2,000 because their son's basketball hoop was a shade of orange, not approved by the architectural committee. I found a widow who was being threatened with a lien on her house over a patch of brown grass in her backyard caused by a broken sprinkler head. Story after story, a clear pattern of abuse emerged. Karen wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She was a tyrant who used the rules as a cudgel to intimidate and control, especially those who were vulnerable or less likely to fight back. Each story was a piece of ammunition, another affidavit for my growing file. The narrative Karen had so carefully crafted was beginning to unravel. The tide was turning, not with a tidal wave, but with 100 quiet conversations, a network of shared grievances that was slowly but surely transforming from a collection of individual victims into a unified opposition. The investigation into Karen Miller and Prestige Builders became our primary mission. Dave, my paralegal buddy, took the lead on the corporate side, while Mike, the Air Force tech whiz from the VFW, started digging into their digital footprint. I focused on the ground game, continuing to gather stories and build our coalition of the wronged. We set up a command post of sorts at my dining room table, which was now permanently covered in maps, legal pads, and printouts. It felt like planning a mission, analyzing enemy weaknesses and coordinating our assets. Dave's first breakthrough came from a deep dive into Prestige Builders' corporate filings. They were a limited liability company, which made it easy to hide ownership, but Dave was relentless. He cross-referenced addresses and registered agents until he found a connection that made my blood run cold. One of the principal partners in Prestige Builders was a man named Martin Vance. A quick search revealed that Martin Vance's wife was named Susan Vance, and Susan Vance's maiden name was Miller. She was Karen Miller's younger sister. Our HOA president, the great champion of community progress, was steering a $4 million development deal directly into her brother-in-law's pocket. It was a staggering conflict of interest, a blatant act of nepotism that she had failed to disclose to either the HOA members or the County Planning Commission. "This is the silver bullet, Jack," Dave said over the phone, his voice buzzing with excitement. "A planning commission can overlook a lot of things, but they can't overlook undisclosed familial and financial conflicts of interest. This taints the entire application." While Dave was untangling corporate webs, Mike was working his magic on the social media and public records front. He discovered that Karen was part of several private Facebook groups for HOA presidents, where she boasted about her aggressive enforcement tactics. In one post, she wrote, "You have to treat the residents like children. A few hefty fines at the beginning sets the tone and ensures compliance." In another, she bragged about putting a lien on a family's home over holiday decorations, causing them to miss a refinancing opportunity. We screenshotted everything, documenting her own words as proof of her malicious intent. But Mike's biggest discovery was financial. He found the publicly available minutes from a Willow Creek HOA board meeting 6 months prior. Buried deep in the agenda was a line item under new business: approval of preliminary consulting agreement with Prestige Builders. There was no mention of a condo project, just a vague consulting agreement. The amount was redacted in the public minutes, but the motion had passed unanimously. This was the seed of the deal. They had been planning this for months, long before they ever approached me. This consulting agreement was almost certainly the mechanism for the kickbacks. The developer would pay the HOA, and by extension, its board, a massive fee for their cooperation in securing the rezoning. It was a legal, if unethical, way to bribe the very people who were supposed to be representing the homeowners. Armed with this new information, I went back to the people I'd spoken with inside Willow Creek. When I showed the widow with the brown lawn and the family with the basketball hoop the evidence of Karen's self-dealing, their frustration turned to cold fury. They had been paying exorbitant HOA dues for years, dues that were apparently being used to line the board's pockets while they were being fined into submission. The fight was no longer just about my 10 acres. It was about the soul of their community. We now had a multi-pronged attack vector: Karen's long-standing pattern of harassment, documented through affidavits from residents, her malicious intent proven by her own words on social media, and the explosive conflict of interest with her brother-in-law's development company. We compiled everything into a single, comprehensive dossier. It was thick, meticulously organized, and damning. Each affidavit was notarized. Each screenshot was time-stamped. Every corporate filing and meeting minute was certified. We made 10 copies. One for each member of the Planning Commission, one for the county attorney, one for the local newspaper, and a few spares just in case. The night before the hearing, my small team gathered at my house: Dave, Mike, Sarge from the VFW, and Mr. and Mrs. Garcia. We sat around the table, the dossier in the center like a time bomb. "Are you ready for this, Jack?" Sarge asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the quiet. I looked at the faces around me: a paralegal, a computer expert, a retired couple who just wanted to garden in peace, and an old soldier. We were an unlikely army. "They started this fight," I said, my hand resting on the stack of papers. "Tomorrow we finish it." The Rutherford County Planning Commission meeting was held in a sterile, wood-paneled room in the basement of the courthouse. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cheap coffee. By the time I arrived, the room was already packed. My guys from the VFW post were there, as promised. About 15 of them, all in their 70s and 80s, sat in the front 2 rows, wearing their VFW and American Legion hats. They were a silent, stoic wall of honor and integrity, a stark contrast to the slick, suited representatives from Prestige Builders who were schmoozing with a couple of the commission members. Karen Miller was in her element, holding court near the front, dressed in a power suit that looked both expensive and uncomfortable. She radiated an aura of absolute confidence, smiling and shaking hands, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over her head. The Garcias were there, along with the family of the basketball hoop and the widow with the brown lawn. They sat together, a small island of quiet defiance. The hearing began with procedural formalities. Then the chairman, a tired-looking man named Henderson, called Petition Z 202307. Karen and a smooth-talking developer from Prestige named Todd stepped up to the podium. Todd led the presentation. He clicked through a glossy PowerPoint filled with architectural renderings of the proposed condos. They were soulless, beige boxes, but he described them in glowing terms. A vibrant addition to the community, a commitment to luxury living, a boon for local property values. He spoke of green spaces and walking trails, all conveniently located on what was currently my land. Then Karen took over. She played the part of the dedicated community leader perfectly. She spoke of the overwhelming support from her residents and the tremendous amenities the project would provide. She framed the rezoning not as a hostile takeover, but as a natural, necessary step in the evolution of Willow Creek. She referred to my property as a blighted, underutilized parcel that was an eyesore and a drag on the community's aesthetic. She never used my name, only the landowner, casting me as an anonymous, unreasonable obstacle. She finished with a flourish. This is about progress, about moving our community forward into the future. The commission members seemed to be buying it. A couple of them were nodding along. Then Chairman Henderson looked down at his list and said, "We have one registered speaker in opposition, Mr. Jack Riley." I walked to the podium carrying my dossier. I could feel Karen's eyes on me, a look of smug pity on her face. She thought I was about to give some emotional, rambling speech about my rights. She was wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I simply stated the facts. "Good evening, members of the commission," I began, my voice calm and steady. "My name is Jack Riley. I am a retired Master Sergeant from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and I am the owner of parcel ID 772-A-4. I am here tonight not just to object to this petition, but to expose it for what it is, a corrupt, self-serving land grab orchestrated through deceit and abuse of power." A murmur went through the room. Karen's smile vanished. I started by establishing the legal history of my land, my ironclad deed. Then I moved on to the core of my argument. The petitioners claim my land is undeveloped. This is a photograph of my home, which I built with my own hands. I placed an 8 by 10 photo on the projector. This is my workshop. This is my garden. This is the tractor they are illegally fining me for. Does this look undeveloped to you? I then addressed Karen's pattern of abuse. This petition is not an isolated incident. It is the culmination of a years-long campaign of harassment. I am submitting into the record notarized affidavits from multiple residents, both inside and outside the HOA, detailing a clear pattern of targeted harassment, intimidation, and financial extortion by Ms. Miller. I slid the stack of affidavits toward the clerk. The Garcias nodded grimly. The chairman's expression shifted from boredom to focused attention. "But the most significant issue," I continued, my voice dropping slightly, "is the profound and undisclosed conflict of interest at the heart of this deal." I paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. The lead developer, Prestige Builders, is co-owned by Mr. Martin Vance. Mr. Vance is Karen Miller's brother-in-law. Gasps rippled through the audience. Karen went pale, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The developer, Todd, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. This financial relationship was never disclosed to the HOA members who are being promised community benefits, nor was it disclosed on this application to the county. This isn't community progress. It's a family business deal, and I have the corporate filings right here to prove it. I placed the documents on the projector. The room erupted. The chairman hammered his gavel, calling for order. I had one last card to play. "Furthermore," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "I have evidence that this deal includes a substantial consulting fee to be paid to the HOA board, which appears to be nothing more than a thinly veiled kickback. This isn't just unethical, it borders on criminal." I submitted the HOA meeting minutes. The commission members were now staring at Karen with open hostility. The residents of Willow Creek who had come to support her were looking at her with betrayal in their eyes. My work was done. I concluded, "I urge you to dismiss this petition and to launch a full investigation into the conduct of the Willow Creek HOA board and its dealings with Prestige Builders. Thank you." I walked back to my seat. The VFW guys gave me solemn, approving nods. The room was in chaos. Chairman Henderson, his face grim, called for a 10-minute recess. Karen shot me a look of pure hatred, a look that promised retribution. But I knew, and she knew, that she had already lost. The truth, presented calmly and backed by undeniable evidence, was a weapon she had no defense against. The Planning Commission reconvened, but the atmosphere in the room had irrevocably changed. The air of board bureaucracy was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. Chairman Henderson looked as though he had aged 10 years during the recess. He spoke into the microphone, his voice heavy. After reviewing the documents presented by Mr. Riley, the Commission has serious concerns regarding potential conflicts of interest and procedural improprieties in this application. He announced that Petition Z 2023-07 was being tabled indefinitely, pending a full investigation by the County Attorney's Office into the allegations. He specifically mentioned the undisclosed familial relationship and the consulting agreement. It was a complete and total victory. Karen and the developer, Todd, gathered their things in a stunned silence, their glossy presentation now looking like a cheap prop from a failed play. As they scurried out, they were met with the icy glares of their own residents. The smear campaign had boomeranged. The villain was no longer the stubborn veteran, but the corrupt HOA president. My allies surrounded me, clapping me on the back. Mr. Garcia shook my hand with both of his eyes wet with tears. "You did it, son," he said. "You gave us a voice." But I knew this wasn't over. Tabling the petition was a major win, but Karen was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are dangerous. The investigation would take time, and in the meantime, she was still the president of that HOA. I needed to end this, permanently. The next morning, I was back at my dining room table command post with Dave on speakerphone. We had won the public battle, but the war was economic. The entire project was predicated on a $4 million investment. Without that money, Prestige Builders was nothing. The developer is just a shell, Jack, Dave explained. Guys like this operate on OPM, other people's money. We need to find the source of that money and show them what a bad investment this is. This was the mission objective, not to sue, not to protest, but to make the entire enterprise so toxic that the money would run away. Using the financial disclosures in the planning application, Dave traced the funding for the project to a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm based out of Charlotte called Blue Ridge Capital Investors. They weren't a household name, but they managed a substantial portfolio. They were the kind of firm that prized stability and predictable returns above all else. They hated risk, and they especially hated public, messy, unpredictable risk. I spent the afternoon preparing. I didn't draft a legal threat. I drafted a risk assessment memo, just like I used to do in the Corps of Engineers before a major construction project. I laid out the situation in cold, dispassionate financial terms. Point 1. The foundational zoning permit is indefinitely suspended pending a county-level investigation. Point 2. The project's community liaison, Karen, is the subject of that investigation for a direct, undisclosed conflict of interest. Point 3. There is now significant, organized, and media-aware community opposition, including a coalition of military veterans. Point 4. There is documented evidence of potential financial malfeasance, the kickback scheme, that could trigger state-level inquiries. I concluded the memo by stating that any investment in this project carried a high probability of total loss due to legal challenges, reputational damage, and indefinite delays. I attached the key pieces of evidence: the corporate filing showing the family connection, the HOA minutes, and a copy of the official county notice of investigation. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I made the call. I asked for the head of portfolio management, a man named Robert Stills. I got his voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sent him an email with the subject line, Urgent Risk Analysis, Prestige Builders / Willow Creek Project. I attached my 2-page memo and the supporting documents. I simply wrote, Mr. Stills, as a courtesy, I wanted to ensure you were aware of the significant unmitigated risks associated with a project your firm is backing. Please see the attached. Sincerely, Jack Riley. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't demand anything. I just handed him a lit fuse. The phone rang less than 30 minutes later. It was Robert Stills. His voice was clipped, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. Riley," he said, "I've read your email. Where did you get this information?" "It's all a matter of public record, sir," I replied calmly. "You just have to know where to look." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him shuffling papers. He wasn't angry at me. He was furious at the people who had exposed his firm to this mess. "We were told this was a straightforward acquisition and build," he said, more to himself than to me. "We were not made aware of any of these complications." "I understand," I said. "That's why I felt it was my professional courtesy to inform you." He was silent for another moment. "Thank you for your professionalism, Mr. Riley," he said, and the line went dead. That was it, the single phone call. I had planted the seed of doubt not in the mind of my enemy, but in the mind of my enemy's paymaster. And in the world of high finance, doubt spreads faster than fire. The effect of that phone call was like a silent financial demolition. There was no grand explosion, just a sudden, catastrophic structural failure. 2 days later, a small article appeared on page B7 of the local paper's business section. The headline was simple: "Prestige Builders Halts Willow Creek Condo Project." The article quoted a spokesperson from Prestige who cited unforeseen challenges in the municipal approval process and a strategic realignment of capital. It was corporate speak for, "We got caught and our funding was pulled. The $4 million deal was dead. It had been killed not in a courtroom, but with a single well-placed email and a 5-minute phone call." Karen Miller must have found out at the same time the rest of the world did. Her response was to call an emergency, residents-only meeting of the Willow Creek HOA. I wasn't invited, of course, but my new network of allies inside the community made sure I got a full report. The meeting, they said, was a disaster for her. She stood before the residents, her face blotchy and her voice strained, and tried to spin the narrative one last time. She blamed me, the obstructionist recluse. She blamed the Anti-Growth Planning Commission. She blamed the biased local media. She blamed everyone but herself. But her power was gone. The residents, now armed with the truth about her self-dealing and the knowledge that she had lied to them for months, were no longer afraid of her. The first to speak was the father of the boy with the basketball hoop. "So let me get this straight, Karen," he said, his voice ringing through the silent community center. "You were fining my family thousands of dollars for a toy while you were trying to funnel millions to your brother-in-law?" The room erupted in angry murmurs. Next, the widow with the brown lawn stood up. "You threatened to put a lien on my home, the home I shared with my husband for 40 years, over a broken sprinkler. For what? So you could get a new clubhouse?" The murmurs grew into shouts. Then Mr. Garcia, emboldened by the public hearing, rose to his feet. "You have been a bully in this community for 20 years, he declared, his voice shaking with righteous anger. "You use the rules not to help the community, but to hurt people. We are done being afraid of you." The meeting descended into chaos. Residents were demanding her resignation, calling for a full audit of the HOA's finances, and shouting questions she couldn't answer. Her carefully constructed facade of the benevolent, order-keeping matriarch had shattered, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. She had lost the one thing she craved above all else: control. She tried to bang her gavel to restore order, but the sound was lost in the chorus of angry voices. Stripped of her developer deal and her authority, she was just a woman in a power suit, utterly powerless. The fallout continued for weeks. Prestige Builders formally withdrew their rezoning application from the county. The county attorney's office, prompted by my evidence, launched its own formal investigation into the HOA's finances, focusing specifically on the consulting fee and other potential instances of fraud. Karen's brother-in-law, Martin Vance, quietly resigned from Prestige Builders. His name was scrubbed from their website overnight. The investment firm, Blue Ridge Capital, issued a terse statement that they had divested from all projects associated with Prestige Builders, effectively blacklisting them from future funding. Karen's greed and overreach had not only destroyed her own reputation, but had also torched her family's business and salted the earth for any future development. It was a complete and utter rout, executed with the precision of a military campaign. I watched it all from my porch, sipping my morning coffee and listening to the birds. The quiet hum of my tractor in the distance, a constant reminder of what I had been fighting for. The daily deluge of violation notices from the HOA had stopped. The survey stakes with their mocking pink ribbons had been removed. The war was over. The final act of Karen Miller's downfall was as petty and bureaucratic as her reign had been. The residents of Willow Creek, led by the Garcias in the basketball hoop family, successfully petitioned for a special election to recall the entire HOA board. The vote wasn't even close. Karen was removed from the presidency by a margin of 9-1. Her two silent, polo-shirted henchmen were voted out with her. It was a public and deeply personal humiliation. I heard she didn't even show up to the meeting where the results were announced. A week later, a for sale sign appeared on her perfectly manicured lawn, right next to the HOA-approved landscape lighting. The tyrant was abdicating her throne and abandoning her kingdom. The state attorney general's office eventually concluded its investigation. While they didn't find enough evidence for criminal fraud charges, the consulting fee had been cleverly worded by lawyers to stay just inside the legal lines. Their official report was scathing. It detailed a pattern of gross financial mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and unethical conduct by the previous board. That report became public record, a permanent stain on Karen Miller's name. It was a fitting end, not a jail cell, but a legacy of shame documented in triplicate. Her weapon of choice, paperwork, had become her final judgment. The new HOA board was made up of reasonable people, including the father who had spoken up at the meeting. One of their first official acts was to send me a letter. It was on the same heavy cardstock with the gold embossed logo, but the content was worlds apart. It was a formal apology on behalf of the Willow Creek Estates community. It acknowledged the harassment I had endured and stated for the record that the HOA recognized and would forever respect the sovereignty of my property. They even rescinded all of the outstanding fines and expunged them from their records. It was a complete and unconditional surrender. They offered to pay for an independent surveyor to remark our shared property line, a gesture of goodwill I accepted. When the surveyor came, Mr. Garcia and the new HOA president came with him. We walked the line together, not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We replaced the temporary hostile pink ribbon stakes with permanent granite markers, a clear and enduring symbol of the new peace. The community began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and conformity lifted. The basketball hoop went back up, its bright orange a small beacon of freedom. The Garcias expanded their garden, and other neighbors started planting their own, no longer afraid of being cited for growing the wrong kind of flowers. People started talking to each other again, not about violations and covenants, but about their kids and their lives. The change was remarkable. By removing the source of the poison, the community had a chance to recover. My life returned to the quiet rhythm I had always wanted. The sounds of my workshop, the smell of sawdust, the satisfaction of splitting wood for the winter. These simple things felt profound, earned. My wife, Sarah, who had stood by me with quiet strength through the entire ordeal, brought me a glass of lemonade one afternoon as I was working on the porch. "It's finally over," she said, leaning against the rail I had built. I looked out over my land, my 10 acres. The meadow was green and lush. The trees stood tall against the blue sky. My old John Deere sat proudly by the barn, a monument to persistence. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was a principle. It was the idea that a person has the right to their own piece of the world, to live on it as they see fit, free from the tyranny of those who think their rules should apply to everyone. "Yes," I said, taking her hand. "It's over." The victory wasn't in the collapse, deal, or Karen's public disgrace. It was in this moment of peace. It was in the knowledge that we had not just defended a piece of land, but we had restored a piece of justice to the world, proving that one determined person, with the help of a few good friends, can indeed stand up to a corrupt system and win. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, and for the first time in a long time, the silence felt truly, completely peaceful.